This Shabbat, we have a double parsha, 2 Torah portions for the price of 1, Acharei Mot and Kedoshim. Last night, I offered a reflection on how these 2 Torah portions might help us to deal with the events of this past week. And I'd like to add another element to that this morning. It was a terrible week. It was a week of loss, pain, death, destruction, of malicious harm, of murder. And I suggested last night that particularly for our young people who were too young in 2001, especially for those who live in Boston, the Boston area, that this was, in essence, their 9/11. That moment when they discovered that there are people who truly mean us harm, who would kill us for nothing that we have done except for who we are and what we represent. And learning to live with that and how to respond to it becomes a very significant and important challenge. I'll reiterate that I pointed out that I was particularly moved by the words of Thomas Friedman in an op-ed piece he wrote this week when he told us that it would be a very wise thing, in his opinion, not to turn Boston into a shrine, a memorial shrine, but to keep it a place where people run marathons and celebrate freedom. That we not allow these events to affect our commitment to live the life that we lead, to be the kind of society and the kind of people that we are, that we be life-affirming people, and that we do not allow those who would wish us harm to change us. And I pointed out that the second of the 2 parshiot, Kedoshim, is, as I shared with the young people, our B'nai Mitzvah, really a compendium of the highest values of our tradition, including the words, love your neighbor as yourself, and that one very important and good response to this tragedy is to commit ourselves and recommit ourselves to a values-based life, a life of love, a life of honesty and decency, a life of morality. I'd like to focus for a moment on something we learned from Parashat Acharei Mot. Acharei Mot literally means, coincidentally, after the death. And by after the death, it is speaking of after the tragic death of the 2 sons of the high priest Aaron, his sons Nadav and Avihu, who, strangely enough, are blown up. Such a coincidence. We could imagine such a thing. Young people blown up, burned to death in a tragic fire. And the response of the Torah in Acharei Mot is to teach us about the rituals of Yom Kippur. For those not familiar with our tradition, guests of a different heritage, this is our Day of Atonement, the holiest day of the Jewish year. And the rituals in antiquity were quite different than they are today, but extremely interesting, and I think they teach us something about healing and the kind of healing that we need after a week such as the one that has just passed. The ritual involves 2 goats. One is to be sacrificed, and the other is to be dispatched into the wilderness. What the priest does is he brings the 2 goats together at the temple in the eyes of the people, and symbolically, by putting his hands on the heads of the goats, transfers the people's sins and iniquities onto the goats. Thereby we get the word the scapegoat. The word scapegoat comes from this teaching. One will be offered as a sacrifice, the other will be set free into the wilderness. And our sages ask this very interesting question. Are we really supposed to believe that by some kind of magic, that the priest can put his hands on the goat's head, that sin is really going to be, my wrongdoing is going to somehow be literally transferred onto that animal and made to go away? Are we, in essence, to delude ourselves into thinking that in this magical rite, that something significant, like overcoming serious wrongdoing, is actually going to happen and be accomplished? And the great Jewish scholar Maimonides, who lived around the year 1200, suggests the following. Don't think for a moment that this act is magic. Don't think for a moment that any actual removal of sin happened. What does happen, he says, is that it takes a person who may be deeply mired in their sense of wrongdoing and iniquity, with low self-esteem and a sense of self-loathing and regret for the wrongs, and the worse the transgression, the more the sense of lowered self-image. Such a person sees a ritual like this and is given the possibility of imagining themselves freed from sin. And what we're talking about here is the power of ritual to spark imagination. We're talking about spiritual, religious imagination. And I think that this a kind of a consciousness-raising act. And I think that's a big part of what our rituals are about. To spark our imagination. We need rituals of healing after this past week. We need to imagine a world free of such things. Those who have been hurt, those who are now mourning, need to imagine life anew. I think it's the only way that they can find renewal. We have to imagine a better world, because if we can imagine it, we can actually help make it real. If we imagine ourselves as whole people, we can actually lift ourselves up one foot in front of the other until we become that kind of person. And I would say that for our B'nai Mitzvah today, the ritual we perform today is not magically they're not going to be a different person altogether than walked into the sanctuary this morning. But this is a ritual that sparks, hopefully, their imagination to see themselves as a person who is a representative of this noble and beautiful tradition, that they should see themselves, him and her, as bearers of a testament of values, of high aspiration for the kind of people and the kind of world we can live in. And so now, as we read from Parshat Kedoshim, I urge us to spark our own religious imaginations, to think about the kind of world we want to live in, to imagine ourselves healed and raised up by visions of what our life is at its best. We all have low moments. We as a society and a country have faced way too many crises. In order to find a better day, we have to begin by imagining it and envisioning it, and then go forth to do the work to make it a reality.